The screen of my phone lit up in the middle of the night. It was a text from my own son. It read, "Dad, plans changed. You're not going on the cruise next week. Monica only wants her family there." The very next day, I cut off every cent of their funding, sold the house they were living in, and walked away from the city entirely. By the time they returned from that lavish vacation, the home they thought was theirs had been stripped down to the bare studs. Before I dive into exactly how I systematically dismantled their perfect little life, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from. And if you've ever had to teach a self-entitled family member a brutal lesson in reality, hit that like button and subscribe. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I'm 70 years old, and for 40 years, I ran a tough, no-nonsense construction firm in Seattle. It was a Tuesday, 6 in the morning. Outside the window, the Seattle sky was that heavy, damp gray that had been hanging over the city for months. I was sitting at my kitchen table, slowly sipping a cup of black coffee. The house was quiet. It had been painfully quiet ever since my wife, Diane, passed away 3 years ago. I was just staring at the empty chair across from me, my mind full of her, when my phone, resting on the cold granite countertop, vibrated. It was a text from Derek, my 34-year-old son, the one I had practically broken my back for on construction sites just to give him a life of comfort. I picked up the phone expecting a simple question about our upcoming trip, maybe something about flight times or luggage tags. Instead, the glowing words on the screen hit me like a physical blow to the chest. "Dad, plans changed. You're not going on the cruise next week. Monica only wants her family there." I just sat there in the dim light of the kitchen. I read that text over and over, trying to force the letters to mean something else. "You're not going. Monica only wants her family there." My chest tightened. Let me give you some necessary background so you can fully understand what I was dealing with. This wasn't some cheap weekend getaway to a local resort. This was a 10-day, ultra-luxury Alaskan cruise. I had paid $45,000 for it, all on my personal platinum credit card. I didn't ask my son or his wife for a single penny. I paid it because I wanted to honor Diane. Alaska was the place my wife had always dreamed of visiting, but we never made it because I was always working, always building, always pouring every ounce of my energy into creating a business empire for Derek. When she passed, I promised myself I would take our son on that trip to celebrate her memory. I booked the owner's suite, the top-tier, most luxurious room on the entire ship. It was massive, with panoramic ocean views, a private balcony, and a dedicated butler. I even prepaid for a private helicopter tour over the glaciers. I booked it for all of us, me, Derek, and his 31-year-old wife, Monica. I wanted us to be together. I wanted to share those memories with the only family I had left in the world. And now, my son sends a cowardly text at 6 a.m., casually canceling my participation in my own $45,000 gift, just because his wife wanted her own family to take my place. A cold, heavy silence filled my kitchen. I put down my coffee cup. My hands were perfectly steady. When you've spent 40 years working on massive construction sites, dealing with corrupt suppliers and lazy foremen, you learn quickly that anger is a useless emotion. You don't throw a tantrum. You solve the problem. I tapped Derek's name on the screen and hit call. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the ringing. Once, twice, and then the line went dead. He'd hung up on me. My own flesh and blood, the boy I used to carry on my shoulders, the man for whom I had paid his entire university tuition in cash, was too spineless to even have a conversation. Derek had always been weak-willed. He willingly traded the stern, loving upbringing his mother gave him for the controlling, manipulative grasp Monica had on his life. I took a long, calming breath, steadied myself, and dialed the number a second time. This time someone answered, but it wasn't Derek. "Hello, Harrison." It was Monica. Her voice was low, tightly controlled, and filled with that hypocritical, polite elegance she used whenever she was about to say something truly cruel. She didn't call me Dad. She rarely did. I kept my voice perfectly flat, hiding the storm brewing inside. "Put my son on the phone, Monica." She let out a little dramatic sigh, clearly annoyed that I was being so persistent. "Derek is in the shower, Harrison," she said smoothly. "Honestly, there's nothing to discuss. He sent you the text. The plans have changed." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the gloomy sky outside. "Monica," I said slowly, choosing my words with clinical precision, "that is a $45,000 trip. I booked the owner's suite to honor Diane. You don't just change plans and kick out the person who paid the full fare." I could hear her shifting on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of running water in the background, proving Derek was hiding. Then she said something that shattered the last remaining illusions of our family bond. "Listen, Harrison," she whispered, her tone becoming incredibly condescending. "My parents have never gone on a luxury vacation in their lives. They actually deserve this experience. Plus, my brother Bradley is coming too. And let's be honest, older people like you are too prone to getting sick at sea. It would be a huge burden. You'd just be tired the whole trip and complaining constantly. My parents are in much better shape to actually enjoy the owner's suite." I closed my eyes. The audacity of this woman was mind-boggling. She was openly hijacking my generous gift, my hard-earned money, and my deeply personal tribute to my late wife, turning it into an all-expenses-paid luxury vacation for her parents and her shiftless brother, people who had never contributed a single cent to her life, let alone ours. I stayed silent on the line. I let her offensive words hang in the empty air. Monica took my deliberate silence for a victory. She thought she'd won. She thought she was dealing with a tired, lonely, clueless old man who was so desperate for family connection that he would just roll over and endure this massive insult. "We'll make sure to get you some nice souvenirs from the ports along the way, Harrison," she added, her voice dripping with fake pity. "Just stay home. Relax. Enjoy the peace and quiet. We'll come see you when we get back." Before I could say a word, she hung up. The line went dead, leaving me alone in the darkened kitchen. I slowly pulled the phone from my ear and placed it on the cold granite island. For a long minute, I just stood there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Monica's voice was still echoing in my mind. "Older people like you are too prone to getting sick. You'd just be tired and complaining. In another life, perhaps for another man, he might have screamed in rage. He might have thrown his coffee mug against the wall, calling his son back over and over, demanding an explanation through tears. But I did nothing. When you've run a commercial construction firm in Seattle for 40 years, you learn to handle betrayal in a very different way. To survive 40 years of corrupt suppliers, corners-cutting foremen, and brutal contract negotiations, desperate emotional outbursts don't work. In my industry, when a foundation develops cracks or a massive steel beam bows under pressure, you don't cry over it. You pull out the blueprints, check the structural integrity, and systematically find the root of the rot. And then you remove it with cold, relentless precision. I walked out of the kitchen calmly, leaving my untouched coffee on the counter, and walked down the hallway to my private study. The wooden floorboards creaked softly under my feet, a familiar sound in a house that suddenly felt much too big and much too cold. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk, opened my laptop, and waited patiently for the screen to cast a pale blue glow into the quiet room. I needed to see the exact extent of the loss for myself. I opened my private email and quickly found the original booking confirmation from the cruise line. It was a staggering receipt. The $45,000 had been taken directly from my personal platinum credit card without hesitation. I remembered the day I booked it clearly, sitting in this exact chair. I looked at the framed photo of Diane on my desk, her face smiling from a trip we took to the coast years ago, and I remembered feeling a profound sense of purpose. I was buying a beautiful, lasting memory for us, a grand and affectionate tribute to the wonderful woman who held our whole family together. I had carefully chosen the owner's suite, the absolute crown jewel of the ship, because I genuinely wanted Derek to experience the level of luxury I had spent my life working to provide. I highlighted the long booking reference number, copied it to my clipboard, and navigated to the cruise line's official passenger login portal. My hands didn't shake at all as I methodically pasted the code into the secure login field. I pressed enter. The loading icon spun for a grueling few seconds, a tiny blue wheel turning and turning until the detailed reservation page finally popped up on my monitor. I stared at the bright screen, face devoid of expression. I blinked, leaning in closer as my eyes scanned the passenger list. I scrolled down to the primary guest details, fully expecting to see my name, Harrison Caldwell, listed front and center as the account holder and lead passenger. My name had been completely erased. It hadn't been moved to a secondary cabin. It hadn't been downgraded to a standard interior room. It had been surgically removed from the entire digital system. In the master suite of that massive owner's suite, the exact spot my name was supposed to occupy, was Richard Sterling. Right below him was Margaret Sterling, Monica's parents. The very same couple who had spent the last 5 years making unvarnished, arrogant remarks about my blue-collar background. The same couple who, at every Thanksgiving dinner, constantly judged the rough calluses on my hands. They were now the primary occupants of a $45,000 luxury suite that I had paid for myself. My chest tightened, a cold, painful realization forming in the pit of my stomach, but I forced myself to keep scrolling. There were 2 other passengers on this active booking, Derek Caldwell and Monica Sterling. That made 4 people. The owner's suite was designed to comfortably accommodate 6. I examined the final passenger slot, the one that by all rights belonged to me. Instead, I saw the name Bradley Sterling. Bradley, Monica's 32-year-old brother, an incredibly lazy man who had completely dropped out of 2 different local colleges. As a massive favor, I had personally arranged 3 different entry-level jobs for him, only for him to be rightfully fired from all 3. He currently lived in his parents' basement for free, spending his days playing video games. This fully grown man, who had never bothered to so much as buy me a cheap cup of coffee, was now officially registered to enjoy the private balcony, the dedicated butler service, and the premium dining packages that I had funded with my own blood, sweat, and decades of grueling physical labor. They hadn't just canceled my invitation. If it had been just that, it would have been cruel enough. But this was something entirely different. They had actively logged into my private, secure account. They had deliberately hijacked my prepaid reservation and selfishly replaced me with the entire Sterling family. They had stolen my deeply personal gift and turned it into an ultra-private, all-expenses-paid, luxury family vacation to host people who were greedy, awful, and meant absolutely nothing to me. I leaned back into my leather chair, letting the massive, chilling impact of this betrayal wash over my tired bones. Monica had orchestrated this entire scheme. I knew her cold-hearted methods all too well. She was a master of silent, toxic control, always wrapping her selfish demands in the guise of necessary medical care and profound emotional resonance. She had likely convinced Derek that I was too old, too fragile, or too much of a downer for a fun-filled party trip. She probably spun an elaborate, persuasive narrative that taking her family was, in some way, a great favor to me, gracefully sparing me the extreme physical fatigue of a long-distance sea voyage. And Derek, my spineless, cowardly son, had jumped at the chance to let her do it. He willingly allowed his manipulative wife to log into the booking system, manually delete the name of his grieving father, and generously hand over a small fortune in luxury travel assets to her horrible, condescending in-laws. He remained entirely silent while they ruthlessly hijacked a trip that was intended first and foremost to honor the enduring memory of his own mother. The betrayal was so profound, so calculated, and so vicious that it instantly and permanently stripped away any lingering, foolish softness I might have held on to as a father. I stared at the booking details again. The massive cruise ship was officially scheduled to set sail in exactly 7 days, next Tuesday. The official boarding passes had been generated and saved. Dedicated luggage tags had been physically printed. Extremely expensive premium drink packages had been manually selected. I could see clearly on the screen that Bradley had happily gone in and successfully upgraded his personal drink package to the absolute highest level, giving him unlimited access to ultra-premium spirits every single day. All these excessive, arrogant charges were linked directly and continuously to my personal platinum credit card. Incredibly, the card remained dutifully stored in the cruise system as the absolute default payment method for all ongoing expenses on board. They truly thought they had won. They genuinely believed they had successfully outsmarted me. Monica had looked at me smugly and quickly, foolishly concluded that I was just a tired, broken old man who would swallow this massive insult quietly and obediently, that I would stay home, sadly accepting her hypocritical pity simply because I was too desperate for my son's affection to ever dare create a scene. She arrogantly assumed that my heavy silence on the phone earlier was the pathetic, submissive silence of a completely defeated man. She didn't understand who she had so foolishly provoked. She couldn't logically grasp that a seasoned man who had spent 40 years of incredible hardship dominating the cruel, unforgiving world of commercial construction contracting would never just give up his hard-earned assets. I never let greedy, awful people steal my expensive raw materials when I was building massive skyscrapers. I certainly never allowed lazy, self-entitled parasites to quietly and continuously drain my private bank accounts while I was accumulating my wealth without making them face serious, devastating consequences. I stared at the glowing screen, my small digital cursor sliding quietly over each of the arrogant names in the Sterling family. A slow, cold clarity washed over my busy brain. The deep sadness had vanished, evaporated in the crisp morning air. In its place was a state of acute, tactical, and purely destructive energy. I reached out for the yellow legal pad I always kept centered on my wooden desk and set my heavy metal pen down. I began to write a detailed, precise list. I would not cancel those expensive cruise tickets right now. That move was too simple, too easy. It would only be a temporary inconvenience for them, one they could eventually fix. I wanted them to pack their expensive designer luggage. I wanted them to drive to the busy, crowded port. I wanted them to board that massive luxury ship, feel the fresh, cold sea breeze, and deeply experience the arrogant thrill of their stolen victory. I wanted them trapped on that massive metal ship, safe and secure. With a quiet, definitive, and satisfying snap, I closed my silver laptop. The fragile foundation of our entire family wasn't just cracking under pressure. It had rotted out from the very core. And now it was time to tear the whole structure down. My smartphone vibrated on the hard granite island, breaking the morning silence. I looked down at the bright screen. Derek's name appeared in bold black text. 22 minutes had passed since Monica had slammed the phone down. 22 minutes of absolute silence. Presumably, my son was gathering the little courage he needed to face his father. I let the phone vibrate 3 times. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted him to sit in the tension caused by his cowardly actions a little longer before I granted him the privilege of an audience. On the 4th long ring, I reached out and swiped the green icon to answer. I held the device to my ear, simply breathing, waiting for him to speak first. I offered no warm greeting. I just let the empty, dead air press heavily against his guilty conscience. "Dad? Are you there?" Derek's voice came through the small speaker. It was trembling, thin and stretched tight by neurotic anxiety. "Yes, Derek, I'm here," I replied. My voice was perfectly flat, devoid of any paternal warmth. It was the exact tone I used to use when dealing with dishonest concrete suppliers who tried to cut corners on major commercial projects. I heard my son swallow hard on the other end of the line. "Listen, Dad," he began, immediately stumbling over his rehearsed lines. "I'm really sorry about everything suddenly changing like this. Monica didn't mean to sound so harsh on the phone earlier. It's just, we're dealing with a highly sensitive, very complex medical situation right now." I remained completely silent, forcing him to desperately fill the uncomfortable void. "Monica has been struggling with severe clinical depression for the last few months," Derek continued, his voice dropping into a hushed, dramatically serious whisper. "Her licensed therapist strongly suggested that she needs a stress-free, emotionally supportive environment to recover properly. The professional specifically advised that she should only spend high-quality, uninterrupted healing time with immediate family. Her parents and her brother know exactly how to manage her fragile emotional triggers. I listened to this pathetic, meticulously constructed lie spilling out of my 34-year-old son's mouth. The level of manipulation was truly staggering. They were actively weaponizing the concept of mental health to casually justify the theft of a $45,000 luxury vacation. I knew very well that Monica didn't have severe clinical depression. Just 3 days ago, I had personally seen her at a rowdy, expensive downtown Seattle restaurant with a large group of friends, drinking cocktails and laughing so hard she could barely stand. The whole therapy narrative was a convenient, perfectly timed excuse designed to paint me as a villain if I dared to oppose their blatant theft. "It's just for her mental health, Dad," Derek pleaded, his voice sounding increasingly desperate for my blind approval. "You know how important family support is during a major psychological crisis. We didn't want to drag you down with her emotional baggage during what was supposed to be a fun, relaxing trip. If you had to accommodate her strict dietary needs and her therapy schedule, you would just feel stressed. Honestly, it's much better for everyone if you stay home and rest quietly. We fully intend to pay your fare back. Once our personal finances stabilize a bit, we'll set up a monthly payment plan and slowly compensate you. Please, Dad, try to understand our incredibly difficult situation. Please don't ruin our important healing trip with unnecessary anger." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of deep, heavy disappointment wash over me. I thought of my late wife, Diane. She was a strong, resilient woman who believed firmly in the strict, unforgiving concept of personal accountability. When Derek was a teenager, if he tried to avoid taking direct responsibility for his foolish mistakes, Diane would confidently march him back to the scene of the problem, force him to look the victim in the eye, and make a sincere apology. She raised him with tough love, trying to mold his soft clay into a solid, reliable man. But the devastating truth was that Derek had always been weak. He had no structural integrity. The moment he left our strict household and met Monica, he eagerly and completely surrendered his own backbone. He traded his strong, demanding mother for a controlling, manipulative wife who expertly directed his every move. I knew with terrifying certainty that Derek was standing in a quiet corner of his massive mansion, reading directly from a psychological script Monica had shoved into his brain minutes before. He was nothing but a frightened puppet, dutifully reciting his master's lines. He actually thought that throwing out a vague, empty promise of a future repayment plan would magically quell my building rage. He naively thought that mentioning a virtual long-term schedule to pay off a $45,000 credit card bill would successfully blind me to the reality of their vicious betrayal. I knew full well I would never see a single cent of that money. They lived entirely beyond their means, constantly drowning in superficial debt, just to maintain a curated fake image of extreme wealth on their various social media profiles. Expecting them to suddenly develop financial discipline to pay back tens of thousands of dollars was an utterly ridiculous fantasy. But I didn't point out the glaring logical holes in his pathetic story. I didn't demand to see the official medical records from this so-called therapist. I didn't scream about their blatant, awful disrespect, replacing my name with Bradley's for a trip meant to honor my late wife. Instead, I slipped smoothly into the lie. I deliberately forced myself to erase even the slightest trace of anger, betrayal, or sadness from my voice. I took a slow, deep breath, perfectly mimicking the tone of a sympathetic, defeated old father who just wanted his son to be happy. "All right, son," I said softly. My voice was steady, quiet, and completely non-threatening. If Monica is struggling with such a severe, complex medical issue, then of course she needs to be surrounded by her own parents. Mental health is incredibly important. I completely understand why you had to change the passenger details so suddenly. Don't you worry about me. I'll be perfectly fine here at home. You just focus on taking care of your wife and make sure she gets the peaceful, healing environment she desperately needs." A sharp, sudden intake of breath came from the other end of the line. I could actually hear the massive weight of his extreme anxiety being lifted from Derek's shoulders. The absolute relief in his voice was palpable, almost sickeningly sweet. Really, Dad? He asked, his tone instantly shifting from desperate panic to bubbly, arrogant excitement. You're not mad at us? I mean, I know this is a huge, sudden change of plans, and I was really worried you would be furious with me about the financial side of the tickets. I'm not angry at all, Derek, I lied without effort. My face was a cold, expressionless mask of stone. A father's only job is to provide support when his son is going through a difficult time. Go on your vacation, enjoy the fresh sea air, and have a wonderful, relaxing time with the Sterling family. We can easily discuss all the boring financial details and the specific repayment plan anytime after you return to Seattle. There is absolutely no rush. Thank you, Dad, Derek gushed, completely falling into the massive, invisible trap I had just perfectly laid for him. You're absolutely the best dad in the world. Seriously, this means the world to Monica and me. We'll definitely bring you back something exquisite from the glaciers. I have to go help Monica pack her final therapy items, but I'll text you before we board next week. I love you, Dad. I love you too, son, I replied calmly. I hope you have a safe and memorable trip. I took the phone from my ear and deliberately ended the call. The screen went dark, reflecting my own cold, unsmiling face in the black glass. Derek had eagerly bought the entire performance. He genuinely believed his clueless, overly generous old father had swallowed their pathetic fairy tale without a moment of critical hesitation. He was likely walking back to his master bedroom right now, proudly flashing a victorious smile at his controlling wife, confidently assuring her that the stupid old man had been handled and was safely out of their hair. They thought they had safely won the ultimate prize. They confidently believed they were about to embark on the most luxurious, free vacation of their shallow lives. But they were wrong, catastrophically wrong. The real war hadn't even officially begun, and my arrogant son had no idea that he had just handed me the precise tactical ammunition I needed to thoroughly, systematically dismantle his perfectly packaged fake life. I sat in the absolute silence of my study, slowly interlacing my fingers into a steeple, fully prepared to initiate the next devastating phase of my counteroffensive. The heavy mahogany clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the slow passage of time. Suddenly, the quiet atmosphere was shattered by a sharp, buzzing vibration from the smartphone on my desk. The harsh, white light of the screen illuminated the dim room. I leaned forward, picking up the device, fully expecting another text from Derek, perhaps a hollow apology or another carefully crafted lie to ensure I remained placated. However, what appeared on the notification bar was the bright blue logo of my primary financial institution. It was an automated security alert. I frowned slightly, confused. I swiped to unlock the phone and opened the secure banking app. The alert was tied directly to a specific checking account, one I rarely monitored, as it was explicitly intended to remain completely dormant. It was a joint emergency checking account I officially shared with Derek. This account was a relic from a completely different era of our lives, one deeply imbued with emotion. Years ago, when Derek first moved out of our family home for university, my late wife, Diane, had firmly insisted we establish a shared financial safety net for him. Diane was a deeply loving mother, but she was also incredibly pragmatic and fiercely protective. She wanted to ensure that if our only son ever found himself in a genuine crisis, a sudden medical emergency, a major car breakdown, or a catastrophic living situation, he would have immediate, unquestionable access to liquid funds without having to wait for banking hours or international wires. I had initially resisted the idea, believing a young man needed to learn how to actively manage his own financial struggles to build true character. But Diane looked at me with those sharp, uncompromising eyes and calmly demanded that we provide a silent, permanent pillar of financial security for our child. I obediently deposited an incredibly generous sum of cash into that specific account and then effectively forgot about it. Over the decades, even after Derek successfully graduated, found a lucrative corporate job, and eventually married Monica, I had never bothered to formally close the account or remove his name from the list of authorized users. I simply left a substantial reserve of liquid cash in that vault, silently fulfilling my solemn promise to Diane to always provide a safe harbor for our child. For years, the balance had remained completely untouched. Derek clearly knew the strict rules of this arrangement. This money was reserved specifically for absolute, life-altering emergencies. I clicked on the push notification prompting the mobile banking app to load the transaction history of the joint emergency account. The screen refreshed, and my eyes locked onto the bold black numbers proudly displayed at the very top of the ledger. My heart skipped a beat. The total available balance had been drastically and thoroughly reduced. I scrolled frantically down to the recent activities section, my vision narrowing to the latest entries. There, shimmering with vivid numerical clarity, were 3 consecutive cash withdrawals. Each individual withdrawal was for an incredibly specific, identical amount, $9,900. I stared hard at the bright screen, letting this cold mathematical reality wash over my racing brain. 3 consecutive $9,900 transactions executed perfectly within just minutes of each other, efficiently extracting a total of $29,700 in untraceable raw cash from my private emergency reserve. The warm blood in my veins turned instantly to absolute ice. As a cold, calculating man who had spent 40 years navigating the complex management of commercial construction budgets, dealing with massive union payrolls, and skillfully maneuvering through strict corporate banking regulations, I knew exactly what this specific number meant. You do not withdraw exactly $9,900 from a bank by mere coincidence. In the American financial system, any single cash transaction of $10,000 or more automatically triggers a mandatory currency transaction report, CTR, filed with the federal government. It is a strictly enforced legal requirement designed to actively monitor and routinely prevent illegal financial activity and criminal money laundering by deliberately and cautiously keeping each individual cash withdrawal just $100 below that primary statutory reporting threshold. The person physically taking the money was actively engaging in a highly calculated, incredibly illegal financial operation known as structuring. They were intentionally and maliciously bypassing complex federal monitoring systems. They were desperate to extract a massive, life-altering sum of liquid cash from the banking system without generating any official red flags or triggering an automatic security confirmation call to the primary account holder. They weren't just stealing my expensive luxury cruise to Alaska. They were actively and systematically draining my liquid financial assets while feeding me a pathetic, entirely fictional tearjerker about Monica suffering from severe clinical depression. The sheer audacity of their multi-layered deception was physically nauseating. Derek had spent 10 long minutes on the phone earlier, practically begging for my deepest paternal sympathy, emotionally describing his wife as a fragile, troubled woman who desperately needed a quiet family retreat to survive in society. And while all of this was happening, they had brilliantly orchestrated an extremely illegal, meticulously calculated operation to extract nearly $30,000 in completely untraceable cash. I set the phone down on the wooden desk, my breathing unnervingly steady, but my brain operating at a terrifying, hyper-alert speed. Why would a married couple living in a beautiful, incredibly expensive mansion in Bellevue desperately need $30,000 in raw physical cash? You do not use undocumented $100 bills stacked in bundles to pay for normal, legal household expenses like utilities, high-end groceries, or luxury car insurance. You do not need physically structured cash to comfortably enjoy a paid-for luxury cruise, where absolutely every high-end facility is neatly tied to a digital room key. Untraceable cash is collected and used specifically for one purpose: to secretly pay for highly illegal items or shadowy under-the-table services that must never leave a permanent paper trail. My son is no longer just a weak, pathetic coward, letting his terrible wife disrespect his grieving father. He is now an active, incredibly brazen participant in a major financial conspiracy against my personal wealth. The jagged pieces of this dark puzzle finally fit together with devastating clarity. The sudden cancellation of the cruise tickets, the inclusion of Monica's incredibly suspicious family, that manipulative, rehearsed phone call, and now this massive, highly illegal structured cash withdrawal. They genuinely thought I was too old and far too slow to actively monitor my accounts. They had truly crossed the point of no return. I had to face Derek in person. I had to look him directly in the eyes and see the truth for myself. I stood up, grabbed my heavy wool coat from the hallway closet, walked out the front door, and stepped into the crisp, gray Seattle morning. I climbed into my truck and started the engine. It usually took about 30 minutes to drive from my quiet neighborhood, across the floating bridge, and into the upscale Bellevue suburbs. But today the journey felt like an eternity. The rhythmic thumping of tires over concrete expansion joints synchronized perfectly with my frantic heart. As I drove through the winding, tree-lined streets of Bellevue, modest homes gave way to sprawling, multi-million-dollar estates. This community was an exclusive enclave featuring manicured lawns, pristine private driveways, and towering evergreens, a place designed for deep comfort and absolute security. I turned the steering wheel and slowly approached the specific cul-de-sac where Derek and Monica resided. I didn't drive directly into their wide driveway. My instincts, honed over decades of dealing with dishonest contractors and hostile business negotiations, warned me to remain completely hidden. I drove past their property, parked my truck carefully 2 blocks away, and killed the engine. I sat in the silent cab for a moment, just staring at my own calloused hands resting on the steering wheel. I stepped out of the truck and began a short walk along the spotless sidewalk. The cold morning air bit at my face, but I barely felt it. My mind was entirely focused on the massive structure at the end of the street. It was an architectural masterpiece, valued at $2.2 million. I knew the exact assessed value because I was the one who had purchased the property. When Derek and Monica first married, they complained endlessly about skyrocketing costs of living and their inability to afford a decent home in a safe neighborhood. I wanted to provide my only son with the ultimate head start in life, a solid foundation I had to struggle tooth and nail to build for myself. I bought that Bellevue estate entirely with cash. I didn't want them weighed down by suffocating 30-year mortgages or destroyed by volatile interest rates. Yet, my seasoned business mind eventually triumphed over pure paternal emotion. I legally placed the entire property into a strict, revocable living trust. I retained final control over the deed, but I allowed them to live there rent-free. I even paid the incredibly expensive annual property taxes and high homeowner association fees out of my own pocket. I provided them with a flawless, incredibly luxurious existence, entirely devoid of housing expenses. All they had to do was maintain the property and build their lives, and now they were using the absolute financial freedom I provided to systematically steal from me. As I approached the manicured boundary of their property, I hugged the high privacy hedge, intentionally avoiding the wide view of their front door smart camera. The sheer audacity of their deception tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. I slipped quietly through the side gate, my boots making almost no sound on the wet pavers. I bypassed the grand front entrance and moved toward the concealed side door, leading directly into the spacious 3-car garage. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy, brass keyring. I smoothly picked out the silver master key, a spare I had explicitly reserved for major maintenance emergencies. I slid the key into the lock. With a slow, expert motion, I turned the cylinder. The well-lubricated mechanism clicked open with a faint whisper. I gently pushed the heavy fire door and stepped into the cavernous garage. I stood in the center of the cold concrete floor for several seconds, letting my eyes adjust to the dim artificial light. This spacious garage was a pristine, meticulously organized monument to their unearned, hyper-extravagant lifestyle. Monica's brand-new white luxury SUV and Derek's expensive imported sports car gleamed under the overhead lights. Both vehicles were purchased with funds I had generously provided, officially as gifts of early inheritance. I remembered the scene of writing those massive checks for those luxury cars, mistakenly believing I was truly helping them safely establish a completely stable life. Now those cars looked like the spoils of pure theft. The air in the garage was filled with the faint scent of expensive leather interior polish and high-end motor oil. I closed the side door behind me, ensuring the latch clicked silently into place. The house above me was not empty. Even through the thick insulated ceiling of the garage, I could clearly hear the steady, dull sounds of activity. Hurried footsteps across hardwood floors, the sharp, dull thud of heavy items being dropped, and voices. I heard them echoing faintly through the ventilation ducts. I walked slowly toward the interior utility stairs, a narrow auxiliary staircase leading directly to a rear hallway near the spacious master suite. I placed my hand on the wooden railing and began to climb. I carefully landed my boots on the very edge of every single wooden step, skillfully shifting my body weight to avoid making a single squeak. I reached the residential level of the house and slipped perfectly into the dark shadows of the narrow rear hallway. The sounds coming from the master bedroom became crystal clear. They weren't in a state of frantic, depressed panic, packing their bags. They were openly celebrating. I heard Monica let out a sharp, genuine roar of laughter, a sound filled with joy that stood in direct contradiction to the elaborate story she had spun about suffering from severe clinical depression. I stood perfectly still in the protective darkness of the hallway. Through the partially open door of the master suite, I could see bright morning sunlight spilling onto imported Italian carpet. I could hear the distinct rhythmic sound of zippers being pulled on heavy, overstuffed designer suitcases. They were dragging massive hard-shell luggage across the floor, casually discussing which expensive formal wear bring to the exclusive captain's dinner. A deep, cold rage burned in my chest. There was absolutely no medical emergency. There was no need for any quiet, healing family retreat. They were simply packing for an incredibly luxurious, incredibly expensive getaway, a vacation they had cruelly stolen directly from a grieving man. I held my breath, narrowed my focus, and listened quietly as the true, incredibly horrific abyss of their evil betrayal finally began to unfold before me in its entirety. I stood completely motionless in the protective darkness of the hallway. The master bedroom door was ajar, just enough to let a ray of bright sunlight cut across the expensive hardwood floor. I could hear the clear sound of heavy luggage zippers being aggressively pulled shut. Then came Monica's voice. It was absolutely not the hushed, concerned whispers she had used on the phone with me hours earlier. The voice was loud, crisp, and utterly drenched in an ugly, arrogant sense of victory. She was actively mocking me. I could detect the sarcasm in her tone as she mimicked me calmly accepting her demands. She laughed sharply, telling someone in the room how incredibly easy it was to get that stupid old man to hand over a luxury vacation. She bragged about how she barely had to exert any pressure before I rolled over and gave her exactly what she wanted. My jaw tightened. She proudly described my deep grief as a massive flaw and ruthlessly exploited it for her personal gain. Another voice joined the conversation, drawing a harsh, greedy laugh from Monica. It was Bradley, Monica's permanently unemployed brother, a man whose entire existence seemed strictly dedicated to avoiding any form of honest labor. He was lounging somewhere in the room, likely sitting on a bed paid for by my money. He eagerly asked if the boarding passes had all been printed yet. Then he declared loudly that his primary goal for the entire 10-day Alaska trip was to systematically drain the most expensive alcohol on the ship. He gleefully reminded Monica to double-check that the onboard spending account was still firmly connected to my platinum credit card. He vividly described the premium bourbons and extremely exclusive vintage champagnes he planned to order every single night, joking that the amount of alcohol he intended to consume would be enough to send me into a shallow financial grave. He actually used those exact words. He was actively salivating at the prospect of draining my personal finances, all while aboard a luxury cruise I had booked to honor the sacred memory of my late wife. The extreme disrespect echoing in that room pressed on my chest like a physical weight. As I listened to Bradley gleefully anticipate his stolen luxury, my thoughts drifted involuntarily back to those long, arduous decades. I thought of the bitter, freezing rain of late 1970s Seattle mornings. I remembered waking up at 4 a.m., my entire body aching violently from the previous day's labor. I remembered lacing up my worn leather work boots in the darkness, slipping quietly out of the house so I wouldn't wake Diane or young, innocent Derek. I spent 40 long years standing in knee-deep mud, actively pouring heavy concrete foundations, moving massive steel beams, until the physical cartilage in my lower spine was ground almost to powder. I permanently ruined my back, sacrificing my own physical health for one single, unwavering goal. I wanted to ensure my only son would never have to struggle the way I did. I wanted to build a massive, impregnable financial fortress so Derek could live a beautiful, safe life, completely free from the devastating anxiety of poverty. Diane and I sacrificed absolutely every personal enjoyment just to give that boy the world. And now there he was, my son, the ultimate product of all those arduous sacrifices. He stood in that bedroom in complete silence while his manipulative wife and parasitic brother openly mocked the man who had given him absolutely everything. He was a coward, a shadow of a weak, spineless man, lacking the most basic moral courage to stand up for his own father. The truly devastating part, the moment that shifted this entire situation from mere, extreme greed to something incredibly dark and sinister, was about to happen. The loud sound of luggage zippers ceased. A few seconds of relative silence filled the room. Then Derek finally spoke. There was no joy in his voice. It was tight, strained, and heavily laced with a deep, cowardly hesitation. He didn't demand that they stop mocking me. Instead, he asked a question that turned the blood in my veins to solid ice. "Are you absolutely certain about the legal documents, Monica?" Derek asked. His tone was a pathetic, fearful whisper, yet it carried perfectly into the dark hallway where I stood. I could clearly hear his feet scuffling nervously against the hardwood floor. "I mean, doing this while we're on a ship, miles away from everything, it feels like a massive risk. We're talking about fundamentally changing his entire life. He hasn't really lost his mind. Monica, we both know he just misses Mom. He's just sad." The absolute weight of those specific words hit me like a runaway freight train. Legal documents. Lost his mind. My breathing stopped entirely. I froze in the cold shadows, my hands slowly clenching into stiff fists at my sides. Derek knew I was perfectly healthy. He admitted that my mind was sharp and that my only real torment was the deep grief of losing his mother. Yet, he was questioning a legal strategy based on a completely fabricated medical premise. Monica offered him no comfort and no moral reassurance. She immediately snarled at him with a tone of such vicious, harsh authority that it made me physically recoil. She snapped at him, asking if he was stupid enough to wait around until I inevitably decided to change my estate planning. She aggressively reminded him that I held the absolute legal power to alter the terms of the family trust at any moment. She coldly asked if he wanted to risk me leaving every cent of the family fortune to some random charity out of pure spite. Then she stated aloud that her parents' private primary care physician had formally signed the initial assessment documents. She announced, with pride, that this incredibly corrupt, well-compensated medical professional had explicitly recorded in writing that I was currently exhibiting severe, undeniable signs of late-stage cognitive decline and early-onset Alzheimer's disease. The sheer, terrifying scale of their coordinated conspiracy shattered the last remaining fragment of my denial as a father. Those 3 recent $9,900 bank withdrawals weren't just for luxury items or paying off hidden consumer debt. This cash was being used to actively bribe a corrupt doctor. They weren't just stealing a vacation. They were constructing a complex illegal medical trap to strip me of my human rights, seize my financial assets, and forcibly incarcerate me in a facility against my will. I stood frozen in the dark hallway, my heart pounding the rhythmic beat of an absolute and merciless war, as I finally realized with terrifying clarity that my own flesh and blood had just formally signed the irreversible legal documents that would permanently and completely destroy my life. The suffocating silence in the hallway was suddenly broken by Monica's vicious voice. She didn't coddle my son's sudden outburst of conscience. She attacked it. Do you really want to wait until your senile father decides to change his mind on a whim? She hissed, her tone slicing through the quiet air like a cold razor. Do you want to sit here patiently until he rewrites his entire will and leaves every penny of the inheritance to some random charity out of pure spite? We've already paid for the legal groundwork, Derek. My parents' private doctor has formally signed the initial medical assessment. The documents clearly state that Harrison is actively exhibiting severe, undeniable signs of late-stage Alzheimer's. I stopped breathing. The floorboards under my boots felt like they were going to collapse. Alzheimer's. The sheer, horrific weight of that specific word hung heavily in the air of the house I had bought with my own blood and sweat. It was the most insidious, cruel lie a person could fabricate. My mind was razor sharp. I was still actively managing my own complex investment portfolios and could remember the exact day I poured the concrete foundation for the first commercial building of my career. Yet, my own daughter-in-law was casually discussing a forged medical diagnosis as if she were simply planning a weekend trip to the grocery store. Suddenly a dazzling realization hit me. The bank alert from earlier today, the 3 consecutive $9,900 cash withdrawals from our joint emergency checking account. I initially suspected they were just using structured, untraceable cash to secretly buy luxury goods or pay off hidden consumer debts. But the dark truth was exponentially worse, that $30,000 in raw cash had been used to bribe a corrupt medical professional. They had brazenly used my own financial assets to quietly purchase a completely fraudulent psychiatric evaluation from a doctor embedded in the Sterling family network. The remaining cash was undoubtedly handed under the table to some completely unethical lawyer they'd hired to secretly draft these sinister legal documents without triggering official red flags. They were successfully funding a legal and medical execution against me, using the very money I had painstakingly saved to protect my son from real hardship. But what if the probate judge wants to question him personally? Derek stammered, his voice trembling with a pathetic, sickening cowardice. Monica, what if the court officially demands a second medical opinion from a completely independent neurologist? He'll fight back. You know my dad. He never surrenders easily when he's backed into a corner. Monica let out an incredibly arrogant sneer that echoed chillingly down the narrow stairs. He won't have a chance to fight back, Derek, she replied smoothly, her voice dripping with dark, vicious confidence. That is exactly why we're leaving first thing tomorrow morning for this cruise. While we're safely floating in the middle of the ocean, completely unreachable and entirely out of the picture, our lawyer will formally file the petition for emergency guardianship with the county court. The judge will clearly see the medical affidavit signed by a licensed physician. I leaned my heavy shoulders against the cold plaster wall, closing my eyes, focusing intently as she carefully outlined the final, devastating phase of her highly illegal and absolutely unforgivable master plan. When the court inevitably asks about this pattern of erratic behavior, Monica continued, her tone almost vibrating with smug, triumphant pride, we simply show them this undeniable fact. He deliberately abandoned his own incredibly expensive family vacation at the last possible moment. We will argue very persuasively that his mental state has deteriorated so rapidly that he is a grave danger to himself, suddenly isolating himself from his loving family and refusing to leave his empty house. It's an absolutely perfect narrative. By the time our luxury cruise docks back in Seattle next week, the emergency court orders will be fully processed. We will simply have a medical transport team waiting quietly at his front door. For his own good, he will be safely transferred to a secure memory care facility, and we will immediately take full legal control of the entire revocable trust. This $2.2 million house, the massive investment portfolio, and all of his liquid cash accounts will finally, officially, belong to us. The degree of precision in their sinister trap was truly breathtaking. They actively leveraged my deep grief over Diane's passing to paint me as an incredibly unstable, reclusive old man. They skillfully manipulated me into voluntarily skipping the cruise, effectively turning my quiet, dignified retreat into the final, manufactured piece of evidence needed to legally steal my basic human rights. If I had just stayed home, oblivious to their dark conversation, I would have woken up next week to the horrific scene of medical attendants forcibly taking me from my home to lock me away for the rest of my life. They were willing to bury me alive legally just to accelerate their inheritance. The pain in my chest was completely gone. The deep, suffocating grief that had been pressing down on my tired heart since I first read Derek's text at 6 a.m. evaporated into the thin air. There was absolutely no lingering trace of fatherly love left in my body. The man standing in that master bedroom was no longer my son. He was a dangerous, heavily compromised liability. He was an active, willing participant in an incredibly complex, vicious conspiracy designed specifically to strip me of my freedom, my dignity, and my hard-earned legacy. I didn't need to hear another word from them. I pushed silently away from the hallway wall, ensuring the heavy fabric of my winter coat didn't brush against the wooden doorframe. With absolute surgical precision, I landed my boots on the exact edges of the wooden stairs, retreating silently the way I came into the dim garage. My breathing was incredibly slow, startlingly deep, and under complete, absolute control. I felt a massive surge of cold, hyper-focused energy suddenly flood my veins. It was the same intense feeling of familiarity I used to get when I'd walk onto an incredibly chaotic, severely behind-schedule commercial construction site, realizing I had to ruthlessly fire the entire management team and actively rebuild the failing project from the ground up. I slipped slowly and silently out the side garage door, feeling the cold morning wind hit my face. I walked back to my truck, parked 2 long blocks away, with a stride that was incredibly wide and entirely purposeful. I climbed quickly into the driver's seat, gripping the heavy leather steering wheel. Any period of silent, crippling grief was officially over. They had declared war, and I was about to launch a financial and legal massacre so devastating that the reputation of the Sterling family they cherished would be permanently destroyed. The drive back across the I-90 floating bridge became a blur of gray concrete and torrential rain. The steady, monotonous hum of my truck's heavy tires on the wet asphalt perfectly matched the cold, mechanical thought process in my brain. I didn't drive back to my empty, dead house. I drove straight into the dense, high-rise heart of downtown Seattle. Towering glass and steel skyscrapers stood like massive, heartless sentinels overhead as I navigated the slick, crowded streets. I steered the truck into the underground parking garage of a modern high-rise office building, killed the engine, and took one final, incredibly deep breath. The raw, visceral sting of absolute betrayal had completely faded, entirely replaced by a profound, terrifying clarity. I was no longer a grieving widower, nor a forgiving father. I was a man actively fighting for his very survival. I stepped off the elevator on the 42nd floor and walked straight through the heavy glass doors of Reed, Sterling, and Vance, one of the most ruthless and respected corporate law firms in the entire Pacific Northwest. The receptionist was a sharp young lady who had known me for over a decade. She recognized the rigid, unyielding expression on my face immediately. She didn't bother asking if I had an appointment. She just nodded quickly, picked up the phone on her desk, and pressed a button silently. Within seconds, the heavy mahogany door at the end of the luxury hallway swung open. Mitchell Reed stood in the doorway. Mitchell was a 68-year-old shark of the legal world, whose tailored Italian suit could barely conceal the predatory instincts of an aggressive courtroom fighter. For over 35 years, he had been my personal attorney, my most trusted confidant, and my closest friend. It was this man who had expertly drafted every airtight contract for my construction business, fiercely protecting my wealth from countless corporate predators. Mitchell took one look at my posture, stepped aside, and ushered me silently into his spacious corner office. He closed the heavy door behind us, ensuring the locking mechanism clicked firmly into place. The room was a monument to legal intimidation, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows with an unobstructed view of the dark, churning waters of Puget Sound. He didn't pour me a drink or ask how my morning was going. He walked straight to that massive oak desk, sat down in his high-backed leather chair, and fixed his piercing gray eyes on me. "You have the exact same look on your face that you had 20 years ago when you ruthlessly fired your entire executive board," Mitchell said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Tell me, who are we going to legally destroy today?" I sat in the leather chair across from him. I didn't waste time on emotional padding or long-winded explanations. I gave him the pure, unvarnished facts. I told him about the text from Derek canceling the cruise. I told him about the 3 consecutive, precisely structured $9,900 cash withdrawals from the joint emergency account. Finally, I told him about my quiet trip to the mansion in Bellevue. I repeated, word for word, the chilling conversation I had overheard between Monica and my son. I described their elaborate plot to illegally purchase a fraudulent medical diagnosis of late-stage Alzheimer's. I detailed their exact timeline, their intention to have me declared legally incompetent and forcibly locked away in a secure medical facility while they safely enjoyed a luxury vacation bought on my own platinum credit card. Mitchell didn't interrupt me even once. He sat perfectly still, hands tightly interlaced, his expression growing darker and more dangerous with every sentence I uttered. When I finally finished, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the spacious office. Mitchell slowly lowered his hands, exhaling a long, highly controlled breath. "I warned you about this, Harrison," he said, his tone devoid of judgment, replaced instead by a cold, terrifying level of professional fury. 7 years ago, when you insisted on paying cash for that incredibly expensive Bellevue property and placing it into a revocable living trust for Derek's active use, I warned you explicitly. I sat in this exact chair and told you that handing over massive, unrestricted assets to a weak young man and a highly manipulative wife was a recipe for financial disaster. I told you that they would eventually view your extraordinary generosity as a permanent weakness. "You were entirely correct, Mitchell," I replied calmly without looking away. I foolishly let the deep grief of losing Diane cloud my rational judgment. I was desperate to provide him with a beautiful, stress-free life. But I am not here today to discuss my past failures as a father. I am here because my own son and his terrible wife are actively conspiring to bury me alive legally. I need to know exactly how far they are in the process. I need to know the specific mechanics of this execution they have planned for me. Mitchell didn't say another word. He immediately turned his heavy leather chair toward his multi-monitor computer setup. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with a trained, aggressively efficient speed. As an absolute senior partner at a massive law firm, Mitchell possessed special high-level access to the secure digital dockets of the county superior court system. He bypassed the public portal and dived straight into the restricted back-end archival network, where local attorneys queued their petitions in a digital line before they were formally stamped by the presiding judge. For several grueling minutes, the soft, rapid clacking of the keyboard was the only sound in the tense office. I watched his eyes scan rapidly over dense lines of legal code flickering on his bright monitors. Suddenly, his fingers stopped moving. His jaw tightened visibly, and a dark, dangerous shadow swept entirely across his face. He reached out, grabbed the mouse, and clicked on a single file. He slowly turned that massive monitor around to face me directly. The bright screen illuminated the dark room, casting a pale glow on the mahogany desk. I leaned forward, locking my gaze onto the striking, highly formal, legal header, displayed clearly at the very top of the digital document. It was a petition for emergency guardianship and declaration of complete incompetence. The primary petitioner listed was Derek Caldwell. The respondent targeted was Harrison Caldwell. Mitchell pointed at the screen with a sharp finger, his voice strained with barely suppressed rage. "They didn't just talk about it, Harrison. They actually paid a corrupt, completely unethical lawyer to to draft this entire execution order. It is fully weaponized and is actively sitting in the secure digital queue. Look at the attached evidence exhibits. They have uploaded a preliminary medical affidavit, heavily implying you have late-stage cognitive decline, signed intentionally by a doctor completely outside your regular medical network. They documented your recent self-isolation due to grief as undeniable evidence that you are suffering from severe mental instability. Look at the scheduled filing date. He tapped the bottom of the screen. Next Tuesday, exactly 48 hours after their massive luxury cruise officially sails out of international communication range. I stared at the glowing document, reading the cold, incredibly clinical language designed specifically to strip me of my basic human rights, seize my entire financial legacy, and forcibly erase me from the civilized world. They intended to quietly submit this massive, irreversible legal bomb to a sympathetic probate judge while they were safely sipping high-end champagne on a private ocean balcony I had paid for myself. They were counting on returning to Seattle, walking off the ship and casually inheriting my massive wealth, while I withered away in a locked, sterile room. Mitchell turned the monitor back and looked at me, a fierce fire of protective rage burning in his eyes. They have officially loaded the gun, Harrison, and they have actively aimed it directly at your head. If we don't dismantle it entirely right now, you will absolutely lose your freedom before this week is over. They think they are dealing with a helpless old man. I stood up slowly from the leather chair and buttoned my heavy wool coat. I looked through the massive window at the dark, churning waters of the Sound. I felt absolutely nothing for the boy I had raised. This betrayal was complete, absolute, and entirely unforgivable. I turned toward my old friend, my voice a cold, chilling whisper of pure destruction. They are not dealing with a helpless old man, Mitchell. They are dealing with the architect who built their entire world. And today we are going to strip their pathetic house down to the absolute frame. Tell me exactly how we slaughter them financially. Mitchell leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the mahogany desk. The intensity burning in his eyes perfectly mirrored the cold flame surging in my veins. He offered absolutely no generic legal platitudes. Instead, he immediately switched into the high-level tactical mindset that made him the most feared trust attorney in the city. He explained that confronting them directly with emotion would be a massive strategic error. If I merely stormed into that Bellevue mansion, angrily demanding answers, Derek and Monica would instantly realize their sinister plot had been exposed. They would immediately contact their corrupt lawyer, frantically attempt to hide their illegal financial tracks, and potentially try to use the emergency psychiatric hold to accelerate the guardianship petition. We needed to operate in absolute, total secrecy. We were going to let them pack their designer suitcases. We were going to let them board that luxury cruise tomorrow morning, fully convinced that their devastating trap was perfectly set. And while they were completely isolated in the middle of the Pacific, drinking expensive champagne on my dime, we were going to systematically dismantle the foundation of their entire financial existence. The first step in our counterattack was to deal with that massive Bellevue estate. When I originally purchased that $2.2 million property for Derek in full, I structured the ownership legally through a revocable living trust. At the time, Derek and Monica were slightly annoyed by this complex legal arrangement, foolishly viewing it as a cumbersome administrative hurdle. They completely failed to understand the incredibly profound, absolute power this specific legal designation granted me. As the sole creator and primary grantor of that revocable trust, I possessed absolute, unquestionable authority to change, amend, or completely dissolve the entire legal entity at any specific moment. I did not need Derek's signature. I did not need Monica's permission. I wasn't even under any legal obligation to inform them that the status of their primary residence was being permanently altered. That house was, in essence, an incredibly expensive gift with highly conditional strings attached. I could withdraw it in any single second, the moment they proved themselves unworthy. And they had just proven themselves incredibly dangerous. Mitchell pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his drawer, sliding a gold pen across the wooden desktop. He began to draft a formal notice of revocation of trust with lightning speed. His sharp brain navigated the complex terminology required to immediately strip the property from the trust with ease. The document stated clearly that the original trust agreement was now officially void. The entire $2.2 million Bellevue property, along with all associated physical and potential equity assets, reverted immediately and completely to my own individual name. I picked up the heavy gold pen, staring at the stark white paper. For one brief, fleeting second, a faint, ghostly memory crossed my mind. I remembered carrying a much younger Derek on my shoulders, proudly showing him the freshly poured concrete foundation for his first childhood home. But that innocent boy was entirely gone, completely replaced by a treacherous stranger actively conspiring to lock me in a medical prison. I gripped the pen tightly and signed my full legal name in heavy, deliberate strokes. Mitchell took the document immediately, stamping it with his official notary seal at the bottom of the page, pressing down hard with a loud click. He handed the document quickly to his senior legal assistant, a stern-faced, incredibly efficient woman who had already slipped silently into the office. He instructed her explicitly to deliver the document to the county recorder's office personally and complete the filing before the afternoon deadline. With that single legally binding signature, Derek and Monica were officially stripped of their most valuable asset. They were no longer living in a multi-million-dollar luxury family estate. They were now merely unauthorized occupants living in a house owned entirely by the man they were actively conspiring to destroy. The financial slaughter had only just begun. We moved immediately to the second phase of our counterattack, the joint emergency checking account, the exact account they had maliciously used to conduct those highly illegal $30,000 structured cash withdrawals. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and laid it flat on the desk between us. I opened my secure mobile banking app, navigating quickly to that specific emergency ledger. The digital screen showed the remaining available balance at just over $400,000. This was a massive reserve of liquid cash, painstakingly accumulated by Diane and me through decades of grueling physical labor. This money was intended to protect our family from true tragedies, not to fund a corrupt medical conspiracy. Mitchell pulled his chair closer, his eyes fixed on the glowing digital screen. As my official defense attorney, he needed to witness the entire financial transaction personally to ensure there would absolutely never be any future accusations of improper asset management. I clicked the transfer icon. I selected the joint emergency account as the primary source of funds. Then I selected a completely private, highly secure independent account, an account I kept entirely separate from the family trust. I carefully entered the exact numerical amount into the transfer window. Every single cent. I didn't leave them $1 for a rainy day. I didn't leave them a dime to pay for their incredibly lavish monthly utility bills or their expensive car insurance. I paused for one final second, my finger hovering directly above the bright green confirmation button. I imagined Monica laughing in that sunny bedroom, openly mocking my grief. I imagined that corrupt doctor signing a fraudulent medical document designed to legally erase my freedom. I imagined Derek, my own flesh and blood, cowardly approving the entire sinister operation. I pressed the button. The digital screen refreshed instantly. The balance of the joint emergency account dropped from over $400,000 directly to zero. This massive, life-altering sum of money was transferred immediately and legally into my impregnable independent account. Mitchell leaned back in his heavy leather chair, an incredibly deep sense of professional satisfaction spreading across his sharp-featured face. He clapped his hands together lightly, the crisp sound echoing in the quiet room. "You have officially cut off their primary financial lifeblood, Harrison," he said, his voice calm and deliberate. "The house is entirely yours. The liquid cash is also entirely yours. By the time they officially board that ship tomorrow, they will be operating entirely on financial fumes without them even realizing it yet. But before they sail away, we have one final, incredibly critical task to complete. We must neutralize that pending court petition before their corrupt lawyer formally submits it next Tuesday. I picked up my phone slowly, sliding it back into my coat pocket. The deep, heavy burning sensation in my chest had been completely replaced by an ocean of pure, freezing ice. I looked straight at Mitchell, my jaw set with absolute, unyielding resolve. We are not just going to neutralize their pathetic court petition, Mitchell. We are going to actively turn it around and use it to legally bury them alive. Tell me exactly how. Mitchell's eyes narrowed, a flash of predatory light flickering in the office's cool gray light. He leaned back, interlacing his fingers into a steeple again. He began to explain standard defensive strategies, suggesting we file for an immediate emergency counter-injunction, preemptively alerting the court to their fraudulent medical documents. He proposed dragging them into a multi-year, incredibly expensive litigation quagmire until they were completely bankrupt. But I shook my head slowly. A long, drawn-out legal proceeding in a sterile courtroom was far too merciful for what they had planned for me. I didn't want them to have the luxury of time, the ability to hire defense attorneys, or the comfort of sleeping in warm beds while we fought. I wanted an absolute instantaneous financial annihilation. I wanted them to return from their luxury cruise vacation to discover that their entire universe had been completely erased. "We are selling the Bellevue mansion," I stated flatly, the words hitting the polished desk like heavy lead weights. "Not next month, and not next week. We are selling it right now, before they've even had a chance to order their first premium cocktail on that ship." Mitchell blinked, clearly caught off guard for a brief moment by the sheer aggressiveness of this reversal. He quickly regained his legal mind, running the logistics through his head. He reminded me that a traditional real estate transaction takes 30 to 60 days to close properly. They would be back from their vacation long before the property officially changed hands. But I wasn't talking about a traditional, comfortable real estate transaction at all. I was talking about a ruthless corporate liquidation. In my 40 years as a commercial construction manager, I had dealt with every conceivable type of real estate investor in the greater Seattle area. When a massive property needs to vanish from the books overnight, I know exactly who to call. In the real estate market, there exists a very specific, incredibly lucrative subculture dedicated entirely to corporate cash flipping. These are massive, incredibly well-funded corporate investment groups that specialize in acquiring distressed or urgent sale properties at a deep discount. They bypass the traditional, sluggish banking system entirely. They buy properties sight unseen, using deep reserves of liquid cash to complete massive transactions in mere days, skipping the incredibly cumbersome appraisal and inspection process entirely. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and slid past Derek's treacherous contact profile. I stopped on a specific name I hadn't dialed in nearly 10 years. Victor Rossi. Victor was a ruthless, incredibly efficient corporate real estate mogul who ran the largest cash-flipping group on the West Coast. Back when I was still liquidating old commercial warehouses, I had engaged in several incredibly profitable, incredibly discreet deals with him. Victor only cared about two things in this world: speed and massive profit margins. I hit the dial button and clicked speakerphone, setting the phone directly in the center of Mitchell's desk. After 2 rings, a sharp, gravelly voice answered. "Harrison Caldwell," Victor boomed, his tone carrying an unmasked, genuine surprise. "I thought you had officially retired and moved to the golf courses. What does a retired construction tycoon want with a guy like me on a damp Thursday afternoon?" "I need to liquidate a prime residential asset, Victor," I said, keeping my voice smooth, completely stripping it of any casual small talk. "And I need you to push this deal through faster than anything you've ever done in your entire career." The casual warmth in Victor's voice vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating edge of a predator catching a scent in the water. "Give me your timeline, Harrison. What exactly are we looking at here?" "I have a flawless, modern architectural estate sitting on a premium double lot in a highly exclusive Bellevue cul-de-sac," I stated, pronouncing each word with absolute deliberation. "The current market appraisal puts the property right at $2.2 million. I hold the deed entirely in my own name. 0 liens, 0 outstanding mortgages, and absolutely no legal red tape. The title is 100% clean. I paused, letting the massive weight of that asset hang in the air. I knew Victor was already running the neighborhood comparables through his head. I'm willing to hand the entire estate over to you at a flat 20% discount, I continued, dangling the massive financial bait. 1.76 million cash. But I have 2 non-negotiable conditions. First, we close this deal and officially record the deed transfer in exactly 3 days. No standard inspections, no lengthy appraisals, no financing delays. Pure liquid cash needs to be wired directly into my attorney's escrow account by Monday morning. I heard a low whistle over the speakerphone. Snapping up a pristine Bellevue mansion at a 20% discount was an incredibly rare, massively lucrative opportunity for a cash buyer like him. Victor didn't even hesitate. If the title is as clean as you say it is, Harrison, I can have my corporate legal team wire the full amount by 9 a.m. on Monday. What's the second condition? This was the pivotal, devastating blow. This was the exact mechanism that would completely wipe out Derek and Monica's comfortable reality. The property must be purchased strictly as is, Victor, I said, my voice dropping into a low, chilling register. And when I say as is, I mean the absolute entirety of everything currently inside. Every piece of custom, imported furniture, every expensive TV, every single designer dress hanging in the walk-in closets, every piece of high-end jewelry left in the drawers, and every digital device sitting on the counters. You buy the house. You take absolute legal ownership of everything within those walls. And I want your most aggressive clean-out crew waiting in the driveway on Tuesday morning. I want them to take absolutely everything left in that house and throw it straight into industrial dumpsters. Keep whatever you want to flip for a profit and completely destroy the rest. A heavy silence settled over the line. Even a ruthless, cold-blooded liquidator like Victor was momentarily stunned by the sheer, unadulterated aggression of the request. But business was business, and the profit margins were undeniable. "You're a terrifying man when you're motivated, Harrison," Victor finally replied, a dark chuckle vibrating through the phone. "You've got a deal. Send the legal address and title documents over to my acquisitions team. We'll start drafting the binding purchase agreement immediately." I hung up the call with a sharp click and looked across the polished wooden desk at Mitchell. My seasoned attorney just stared back at me with a look of deep, respectful awe. He silently acknowledged the absolute brilliance of the move. The financial trap had been set perfectly. We were now completely prepared to bring down the legal hammer. Mitchell leaned back in his heavy leather chair, letting out a low, appreciative whistle. Liquidating a multi-million-dollar estate to a corporate buying group in 72 hours was an absolute masterclass. I thanked my old friend for his swift legal execution, stood up, and shook his hand firmly. We had successfully started dismantling their main financial foundation, but the real psychological warfare was just about to begin. I walked out of the towering downtown office building and stepped back onto the damp Seattle pavement. The heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving the gray city streets slick and reflective under the afternoon sky. I climbed into the familiar cab of my truck, completely ignoring the damp chill seeping through my wool coat. Resting my hands on the steering wheel, I took a moment to fully process the incredibly satisfying reality of what we had just pulled off. Right now, Derek and Monica were spending their afternoon packing their expensive designer luggage, completely convinced they had outsmarted a grieving, helpless old man. They believed their malicious legal petitions were safely stored away, ready to strip me of my entire existence whenever they pleased. They were joyfully preparing to board a massive luxury cruise ship that I had painstakingly organized and fully funded. They thought I was sitting at home, crying over old photographs and losing my mind. Instead, I was actively dismantling every single square inch of their comfortable, unearned lifestyle. However, just taking the house and the emergency cash wasn't enough. I wanted them to feel the heavy weight of their arrogance deep in their bones. I wanted them to experience the exact sense of terrifying helplessness they had so casually planned to inflict on me. I didn't want them standing comfortably in their local driveway when they realized they were homeless and broke. I wanted them completely trapped. I wanted them isolated in international waters, surrounded by an overwhelming luxury they suddenly couldn't touch. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and opened my contacts. Bypassing my personal networks, I navigated straight to the saved reservation documents for our upcoming Alaskan cruise. I dialed the main customer service line for the Royal Caribbean 5IP booking desk. The call connected instantly, and after a brief automated menu, I was placed on a very short hold. A warm, highly professional voice answered, addressing me by name and enthusiastically thanking me for my elite loyalty status. The representative asked how she could assist me with the upcoming embarkation for the owner's suite. I kept my voice perfectly smooth and completely calm, giving away absolutely none of the icy rage burning in my chest. I provided my secure reservation reference number, my personal verification details, and the primary billing zip code to fully validate my authority on the account. She efficiently confirmed my identity and warmly asked if I needed to arrange any last-minute shore excursions or upgrades to our premium dining packages. I politely declined the offers. I told her I needed to make a very specific, urgent administrative adjustment to the primary passenger profile. I explained that due to an unavoidable personal matter, I would absolutely not be boarding the ship tomorrow morning. The representative immediately offered her rehearsed condolences, assuming I wanted to cancel the entire reservation and trigger the standard refund protocols. She began explaining the late cancellation penalties, but I cut through the routine firmly and decisively. I clarified my exact intentions. I explicitly stated that I was not canceling the physical cruise tickets. The remaining passengers listed on the primary profile, Derek Caldwell, Monica Caldwell, and Bradley Sterling, were absolutely still planning to board and sail out on the scheduled Alaskan itinerary. I wanted their physical boarding passes to remain fully active and valid. The representative paused for a brief moment, slightly puzzled by the unusual request, but quickly confirmed that the secondary passengers could absolutely proceed with the vacation without my physical presence. That was exactly what I needed to hear. Then I delivered the final, devastating blow. I instructed her to immediately and permanently remove my primary platinum credit card from the central onboard expense account. I explained that I was completely cutting off all financial responsibility for the remaining passengers. I demanded that my card be entirely unlinked from their individual SeaPass cards, their digital profiles, and any associated onboard credit lines. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line as the representative likely reviewed the long list of prepaid luxuries already attached to that specific card. The premium drink packages, the lavish spa appointments, and the expensive specialty restaurant reservations. She cautiously informed me that doing this would instantly cancel all of those specific premium arrangements. I told her that was precisely my intention. I firmly reiterated that Derek, Monica, and Bradley would now be fully responsible for providing their own independent method of payment the moment they arrived at the cruise terminal. If they wanted to enjoy premium drinks, use the high-speed satellite internet, or participate in any exclusive shore excursions, they would have to present their own credit cards to the ship's purser themselves. I waited patiently on the line as she tapped rapidly away at her keyboard, formally executing my exact instructions. She read off a standard legal disclosure, confirming that my financial liability had been permanently dissolved, and that the remaining passengers would face a zero-balance profile upon boarding. I thanked her for her incredibly efficient assistance and promptly ended the call. I tossed my phone onto the passenger seat of my truck, a cold, undeniable smirk finally spreading across my face. The trap was officially set. The snare was perfectly laid, and the bait was simply too alluring for them to ever refuse. Tomorrow morning they would wake up, load their massive, overstuffed designer suitcases into a premium rideshare, and eagerly head down to the bustling Seattle cruise terminal. They would successfully scan their active boarding passes, step into that massive floating palace, and immediately march straight toward the nearest upscale lounge to celebrate their perceived victory. Bradley would confidently order the most expensive vintage bourbon available. Monica would loudly demand a bottle of exclusive imported champagne, and Derek would smugly hand his digital C-Pass card to the bartender, fully expecting my limitless platinum account to smoothly absorb the massive financial hit. The absolute humiliation they were about to experience when that card was ruthlessly declined was going to be spectacular. They would be left standing in the middle of a crowded luxury lounge, completely cut off from my wealth, forced to desperately drain their own highly depleted bank accounts just to secure a basic internet connection. They would be physically trapped on a massive ship in the middle of a freezing ocean for 10 long, miserable days, slowly realizing that their limitless financial gravy train had completely derailed. And while they scrambled to figure out how to pay for their own extravagant bar tabs, Victor Rossi and his aggressive corporate clean-out crew would be brutally tossing their entire pretentious lifestyle into a rusty steel dumpster. I smiled. The next morning arrived with the crisp, damp chill that defines early spring in the Pacific Northwest. I was awake long before dawn, drinking black coffee in the quiet of my kitchen, methodically reviewing the timeline. By 8 a.m., I had parked my truck in an elevated overlook lot, giving me a perfect view of the bustling cruise ship terminal at the port of Seattle. The luxury ocean liner, with its massive, gleaming white hull, dominated the waterfront, preparing to set sail for Alaska. The terminal below was a hive of chaotic activity. Fleets of taxis and shuttle buses constantly pulled up to the drop-off zones, unloading hundreds of eager vacationers. I sat comfortably in my truck, a pair of compact field binoculars resting on the console. I didn't even need them yet. I knew exactly what time they would arrive. When it came to securing his own luxury, Derek was always aggressively punctual. Sure enough, a black premium SUV glided smoothly into the designated VIP drop-off lane. The driver stepped out, quickly opening the rear passenger doors. My heart beat with a slow mechanical rhythm as I watched Derek step onto the concrete. He was wearing expensive nautical resort wear, looking completely relaxed and entirely carefree. Monica followed closely behind, her face hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses, dramatically gesturing for the driver to handle her mountain of luggage. Then came Bradley, hopping out of the vehicle in a brightly colored tropical shirt that looked utterly ridiculous in the brisk Seattle wind. They stood together on the sidewalk, laughing loudly, completely enveloped in their unearned arrogance. They handed their bags off to the eager porters, fully expecting my elite loyalty status to smooth over every single step of their VIP boarding process. I picked up the tablet on my passenger seat and opened my social media apps. Months ago, I had created an anonymous profile specifically to keep tabs on the family updates Derek often forgot to hide. I navigated straight to Monica's public feed. She had just posted a heavily filtered, freshly snapped photo of the three of them standing proudly in front of the massive cruise ship. The caption underneath read, "Kicking off our much-needed, highly earned luxury getaway. Time to leave all the stress behind and completely pamper ourselves." A champagne flute emoji punctuated the ridiculous statement. Highly earned. The absolute audacity required to type those words after using stolen cash to fund a corrupt medical setup was staggering. They genuinely believed they had successfully outsmarted me. They were convinced the hardest part of their sinister plan was entirely behind them, completely unaware that they were actively walking straight into a flawless, inescapable financial cage. I watched through the windshield as they casually walked through the heavy glass doors of the main terminal, disappearing into the VIP security line. They would be fast-tracked straight onto the ship, bypassing the long lines of ordinary passengers. I knew the exact layout of that vessel. I knew they would head straight for the exclusive top-deck lounges, eagerly anticipating their premium welcome packages. I sat in my truck for another 2 hours, patiently watching the steady stream of passengers board the ship. The massive gangways were eventually retracted, The heavy mooring lines were systematically cast off from the concrete bollards. A deep, powerful vibration rattled through the damp air, shaking the windows of my truck as the ship's massive engines roared to life. Then the ship's main horn delivered a colossal, deafening blast that echoed across the entire waterfront. It was a triumphant, final sound. The massive white hull began to slowly and smoothly pull away from the dock, churning the dark waters of Puget Sound into a thick, white foam. I watched the ship gracefully pivot, pointing its massive bow straight toward the open ocean. They were finally on their way. Within a matter of hours, they would completely lose all standard, land-based cellular signals. They would be entirely dependent on the ship's expensive satellite internet connection, a premium service they now had absolutely no financial means to smoothly access. They were completely isolated, perfectly suspended in international waters, utterly cut off from their corrupt lawyer and their heavily mortgaged reality on solid ground. I shifted my heavy truck into gear, pulled away from the waterfront, and drove straight back to the downtown financial district. Mitchell Reed was already waiting for me in the executive conference room of his law firm. Sitting across from him was Victor Rossi, flanked by two of his own aggressive corporate attorneys. The atmosphere in the room was strictly cold business. There were no pleasantries, no small talk about the weather. We were there to execute a highly lucrative, devastatingly efficient corporate liquidation. A thick stack of final closing documents sat neatly on Victor's polished mahogany table. His legal team had thoroughly verified the entirely unencumbered status of the Bellevue estate. They knew they were acquiring an incredibly valuable asset at a massive 20% discount, and they were aggressively eager to lock down the deal before I could potentially change my mind. I took my seat at the table and picked up the heavy gold-plated pen Mitchell had prepared specifically for the occasion. I carefully read through the binding terms. The phrasing was brutally clear and completely uncompromising. The sale was absolutely, undeniably, strictly as is. The buyer was taking absolute full ownership of the physical property and the entire scope of its current contents. Victor's aggressive clean-out crews were officially authorized to physically force entry into the property at exactly 8 a.m. tomorrow morning to begin the absolute physical liquidation. I pressed the pen to the heavy paper, signing my legal name on the final signature lines. I slid the executed documents across the table to Victor. He reviewed the signatures, gave a sharp nod to his lead attorney, and smoothly pulled a secure digital authentication token from his jacket pocket. Victor rapidly punched a sequence of numbers into the token, authorizing the immediate release of the massive funds. We waited in absolute silence. Less than 3 minutes later, my personal smartphone lit up on the table. It was a highly secure, highest priority, automated alert from my primary banking institution. I picked up the device and opened the encrypted message. The notification was brief, beautiful, and absolutely definitive. A federal incoming wire transfer of $1.76 million had successfully cleared and was now permanently settled into my private, impenetrable, standalone account. The funds were fully secured. The transaction was completely irreversible. Victor stood up firmly, shook my hand, and walked briskly out of the room with his legal team to immediately dispatch his property extraction crews. I was left alone in the quiet conference room with Mitchell. The massive Bellevue mansion, the material manifestation of all their arrogant entitlement, absolutely no longer belonged to my son. Their expensive cars, their designer wardrobes, and every single piece of furniture they had ever owned were about to be brutally discarded into a commercial dumpster. The financial slaughter had been executed flawlessly, and my treacherous son was completely and utterly trapped on a floating island, absolutely powerless to stop it. I sat in the quiet comfort of my living room, the flickering embers of the fireplace casting a warm, dancing glow across the hardwood floors. A steaming mug of black coffee rested on the table beside me. The entire house was remarkably peaceful, the suffocating grief that had plagued me days ago completely gone. Hundreds of miles away, entirely swallowed by the vast freezing waters of the North Pacific, My treacherous son and his conniving wife were currently experiencing the absolute, undeniable reality of their actions. The luxury cruise industry operates on a highly specific, entirely cashless financial model. From the moment a passenger steps onto the decks of the ship, physical currency becomes completely useless. Every single transaction, from premium dining and luxury spa treatments to satellite internet and top-shelf alcohol, is handled exclusively through a digital room card known as a CPass card. That plastic card must be securely backed by a valid, active credit account, and I had completely severed that vital financial lifeline. I knew it would take a few hours for the ship to cruise into international waters and update its internal billing network. Sure enough, my smartphone began to vibrate right on schedule on the coffee table. Because they were completely outside the range of standard land-based cell towers, they were forced to rely on the ship's highly restricted, incredibly weak emergency satellite network to place an outbound call. The connection quality was terrible, heavily laced with crackling static. But the frantic, desperate audio message they left on my secure voicemail system conveyed their absolute panic with crystal clarity. I took a slow sip of my coffee, leaned back into the leather armchair, and tapped the screen to play the first recorded message. Derek's voice echoed through the quiet room. He didn't sound anything like the smug, calculating man who had confidently signed legal documents to steal my freedom. He sounded utterly terrified, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He explained incoherently that a massive, deeply embarrassing misunderstanding had just occurred in the main luxury lounge. Monica, flanked by her entire arrogant family, had proudly walked up to the premium bar and loudly ordered a $500 bottle of exclusive vintage champagne to properly toast the start of their extravagant vacation. The bartender had smoothly taken her digital room card, swiped it through the terminal, and promptly informed her that the transaction was completely declined. Derek stammered through the voicemail, vividly describing the sheer, excruciating humiliation of that exact moment. Monica had thrown a massive, incredibly loud scene, arguing furiously with the bartender in front of dozens of wealthy passengers. She had arrogantly declared that the account was backed by an unlimited platinum credit line, demanding that the staff run the card again. The bartender had tried multiple times before finally escalating the issue to the ship's purser, who coldly informed them that the primary funding source had been explicitly and permanently revoked by the account holder. Derek was practically begging me to call the cruise line to fix what he assumed was a simple administrative banking error. He pleaded that Monica's parents were completely furious and deeply embarrassed by the public spectacle. I let the first message end and smoothly tapped the screen to play the second. This recording had been left a full 40 minutes later. The initial confusion in Derek's voice had completely dissolved, replaced entirely by a raw, sheer, suffocating panic. He had run straight to the guest services desk to purchase a premium satellite internet package so he could access his mobile banking apps and quickly transfer funds to save face. The premium internet connection cost exactly $100 per day. Derek had confidently handed the purser his physical debit card, the exact card tied directly to our joint emergency checking account, the very same account they had used to illegally bribe that corrupt doctor. He told me, his voice cracking with absolute desperation, that the debit card had been completely declined for severe insufficient funds. He was entirely losing his mind, loudly demanding to know how a secure bank account holding over $400,000 in liquid cash could possibly show an absolute, undeniable zero balance. He begged me to pick up the phone. He implored me to contact the financial institutions to report a massive, catastrophic banking fraud. He actually had the sheer audacity to demand that I protect the money he had systematically planned to use for my permanent legal execution. I listened to his pathetic, breaking voice, feeling an overwhelming sense of icy, calculated satisfaction wash over me. They were finally beginning to understand the full, terrifying scope of their bleak situation. They were physically trapped in a massive floating metal box, in the middle of a freezing ocean with absolutely no valid credit cards, zero accessible cash, and absolutely no way to generate any liquid funds. The third and final voicemail was the most telling of all. It wasn't Derek. It was Monica. The thick, arrogant layer of superiority she had displayed in the Bellevue mansion was entirely gone. She was practically sobbing into the receiver. She wailed about how her entire family had ruthlessly turned against her. Bradley, her parasitic brother, was throwing a massive, explosive tantrum in the hallway because he couldn't secure a single drop of alcohol. He had eagerly run down to the poolside bar to begin his 10-day binge, only to be brutally informed that his room card was financially locked down. Monica cried that they had been officially barred from entering any of the ship's premium specialty restaurants. Because they lacked absolutely any valid form of payment, they were strictly relegated to the massive crowded lines of the complimentary buffet, packed in with thousands of ordinary economy class passengers they routinely mocked. She wailed about the sheer indignity of having to stand in a long line just to get a plate of basic free pasta. She vividly described the burning, judgmental glares from her wealthy parents, who had fully expected a flawless, incredibly pampered, luxury experience on my dime. Instead, her parents were now trapped in a small, standard economy stateroom, absolutely furious that their premium bookings had been completely voided. Monica begged me to fix the accounts, promising to apologize for what she referred to as any minor misunderstandings. She genuinely still believed this was just a petty, temporary punishment over a small disagreement. She had absolutely no idea that while she was crying over a declined bottle of expensive champagne and a ruined dinner reservation, my real estate contacts were actively finalizing the complete and total demolition of her entire life back on dry land. I slowly hit the permanent delete button on all 3 voicemails, wiping their desperate, begging voices from my secure digital server. I set my smartphone back down on the solid wood table, taking another slow, incredibly satisfying sip of my hot coffee. Let them eat at the free buffet. Let them endure the brutal, unyielding wrath of her humiliated, arrogant family. Let them slowly spiral into absolute financial madness for the next 10 days, trapped on a massive ship. They earned absolutely every single second of the misery in this beautiful, flawless nautical nightmare. Their precious vacation had officially become a floating prison. The following morning broke bright and clear, a sharp contrast to the heavy gray skies that had mirrored my initial grief days ago. The crisp air felt invigorating as I drove my truck across the bridge, heading toward the wealthy, manicured neighborhoods of Bellevue. I parked down the street, well away from the estate that no longer belonged to my treacherous son. I walked down to a corner coffee shop, grabbed a black coffee, and strolled back toward the property. I took up a comfortable position on the public sidewalk directly across from the quiet, tree-lined street. The neighborhood was peaceful, filled with the quiet hum of automated sprinklers and the distant sound of landscaping crews. It was a picture of suburban tranquility, entirely oblivious to the violent corporate liquidation about to unfold. I stood there, warming my hands against the paper cup, staring at the architectural facade of the house I had originally purchased with a father's heart. At exactly 7:45 a.m., the heavy rumble of diesel engines shattered the neighborhood's peace. 2 massive roll-off industrial dumpsters were backed ruthlessly up the wide, stamped concrete driveway. The heavy steel wheels ground unapologetically into the pristine landscaping Monica had arrogantly demanded I fund last spring, tearing deep ruts into the soft earth. Behind the dumpsters, 3 large cargo vans pulled up to the curb. A team of 12 burly, incredibly efficient men in work boots poured out of the vehicles. Victor Rossi had absolutely kept his word. These men were hardened property extraction specialists, used to corporate liquidations. They moved with a cold precision that was entirely terrifying to witness. The clean-out foreman, a massive man carrying a heavy steel crowbar and a clipboard, walked straight to the custom front door. He didn't bother trying to pick the expensive smart lock. He simply jammed the steel bar into the door frame and threw his weight backward, shattering the locking mechanism with a loud, echoing crack. The heavy wooden door swung open, exposing the pristine interior of Derek and Monica's stolen sanctuary. The financial slaughter began instantly. The workers swarmed into the expansive, sunlit foyer like an organized, ruthless army of locusts. Within minutes, the massive front doors were permanently wedged open, and the physical act of completely eradicating their entire pretentious lifestyle formally commenced. Two burly workers emerged from the front entrance carrying Monica's prized, custom-imported Italian velvet sofas. I remembered the exact day she had purchased them. Without a single hesitation, she had casually handed over my platinum credit card to an elite interior designer, burning through tens of thousands of dollars in a single afternoon, claiming she simply needed the living room to properly reflect her elevated social status. I watched with deep satisfaction as the workers crudely dragged those incredibly expensive white velvet couches across the rough concrete porch. They hoisted the sofas over the rusty steel edges, letting them crash violently into the empty metal bottom of the bin. The delicate imported fabric tore instantly against the sharp edges of the rusty container, completely destroying the massive investment in less than 5 seconds. The relentless parade of destruction never paused for a single moment. Another crew of workers began violently hurling massive black contractor trash bags directly out of the second-story master bedroom windows, aiming straight for the open dumpsters below. Those bags were stuffed to the brim with Monica's incredibly expensive, meticulously curated designer wardrobe. Hundreds of silk dresses, high-end leather handbags, and imported European shoes cascaded like ordinary household garbage into the filthy metal bin. She had eagerly planned which luxurious resort outfits she would proudly wear on the cruise decks, entirely oblivious to the fact that her entire material existence was currently being treated as landfill. Next came Derek's prized possessions. A worker walked casually out of the garage carrying 2 heavy premium leather golf bags filled with custom, incredibly expensive titanium clubs. Derek had insisted he needed this professional-grade equipment to properly network with wealthy executives. The worker grabbed the premium leather straps, swung the bags heavily through the air, and violently hurled them over the high steel walls of the dumpster. The incredibly satisfying sound of bending titanium shafts and snapping carbon fiber echoed loudly through the quiet suburban street. I took another slow, incredibly gratifying sip of my hot coffee as a separate, specialized crew of workers arrived in a small utility van. They completely ignored the massive amount of furniture being violently discarded and walked straight to the main entrance. They carried heavy power drills, brand new brass hardware, and heavy metal strike plates. Victor Rossi was officially securing his newly acquired asset. The workers brutally stripped away the damaged electronic smart lock Monica had previously programmed with her personal security codes. They installed heavy commercial-grade deadbolts on every single exterior door of the massive estate. The physical manifestation of this complete lockout was incredibly powerful to witness. Even if Derek and Monica miraculously escaped their floating nautical prison and somehow hitched a ride back to this specific neighborhood, they would absolutely find nothing waiting for them. Their custom digital access codes were permanently erased. Their physical keys were completely useless. They were now entirely locked out of the very property they had so arrogantly claimed as an undeniable birthright. For 3 highly chaotic hours, the aggressive clean-out crew ruthlessly hollowed out the entire $2.2 million property. They systematically stripped away every television, every piece of expensive modern art, every custom-imported rug, and all the digital devices left on the granite kitchen counters. The massive steel dumpsters were quickly filled to absolute capacity with the broken, ruined wreckage of their completely unearned, incredibly pretentious lifestyle. Not a single photograph, not a single piece of expensive jewelry, not a single pair of designer sunglasses was spared from this violent, unyielding corporate liquidation. Everything they owned, everything they had arrogantly purchased with my stolen wealth, was crudely handled as entirely abandoned, worthless garbage. When the massive job was finally finished, The clean-out foreman blew a sharp whistle. The workers quickly piled back into their unmarked vehicles. A hydraulic diesel truck backed into the driveway, secured the massive steel dumpsters, and slowly hauled them away toward the municipal landfill. The quiet, wealthy neighborhood slowly returned to its pristine, tranquil state, entirely undisturbed by the absolute devastation that had just occurred on that specific prime lot. I stood on the sidewalk for a few more minutes, simply staring at the completely hollowed-out, utterly secured house. The massive front windows, previously adorned with expensive silk drapes, now revealed only bare, empty, echoing rooms. The complete physical eradication of Derek and Monica Caldwell was officially complete. They had absolutely no home to return to, zero material possessions to their name, and completely empty bank accounts. They were currently trapped in the middle of a freezing ocean, desperately drowning in a profound, inescapable financial nightmare brought on by their own unbelievable arrogance. I slowly crushed the empty paper coffee cup in my right hand, turned away from the empty, soulless estate, and walked calmly toward my waiting truck, feeling an overwhelming, absolute sense of deep, permanent, and undeniable peace. In the grand scheme of a human life, 10 days is a remarkably brief period of time. But when you are trapped inside a floating metal cage constructed from your own financial ruin, 10 days can easily stretch into an absolute eternity of misery. I didn't need to physically stand at the port of Seattle to know exactly how that miserable disembarkation process unfolded. My private investigator, Robert Sanchez, had discreetly taken up a position near the main terminal gates, providing me with highly detailed real-time audio updates from a safe distance. Under a gloomy morning sky, the massive white ocean liner slowly drifted back to the dock, but there was absolutely no joy radiating from the returning passengers I was currently tracking. While thousands of sunburnt but happily exhausted travelers eagerly poured down the main gangways, my treacherous son and his parasitic in-laws were severely delayed. They were forcibly detained at the Central Guest Services desk for nearly 2 hours, locked in a fierce, aggressive argument with the ship's purser over their massive, completely unpaid onboard gratuities and mandatory service fees. Because my Platinum card had been permanently revoked and their personal debit accounts were completely drained, they simply had no way to settle their final digital ledger. Robert quietly reported that Monica looked completely unrecognizable. Her perfectly manicured, curated socialite exterior had thoroughly shattered. She was wearing the exact same rumpled designer sweatpants she had boarded the ship in, her face pale and her hair thrown into a messy, disheveled knot. Her parents, who had proudly expected to be treated like nautical royalty, were radiating a toxic, furious silence. They completely refused to even look in Derek's direction. Bradley, having endured 10 straight days of forced, involuntary sobriety, was pacing neurotically near the terminal exit, shivering in the damp Seattle wind. They had spent their entire luxury vacation isolated inside a windowless cabin, eating at the free buffet, screaming at each other over who was ultimately responsible for this catastrophic banking error. They were completely convinced that a massive automated fraud alert had temporarily frozen their assets. They genuinely believed that the moment they stepped off the ship and secured a stable cellular signal, a quick, forceful phone call to the bank would instantly restore their unearned wealth. They had desperately pooled together the absolute last of their physical currency. Between the 5 of them, they managed to scrape together just over $80 in loose, crumpled bills. It was barely enough to secure a standard economy taxi van to cover the long drive back to the wealthy suburbs. Robert watched from a distance as they awkwardly and roughly shoved their massive, heavy designer suitcases into the trunk of the scratched yellow vehicle. They piled into the back rows like miserable sardines, their knees pressed tightly together, the thick, heavy tension inside the cabin completely suffocating them all. Derek, desperately trying to salvage whatever remaining shred of masculine authority he had left, loudly assured his furious father-in-law that everything would be completely resolved within an hour. He loudly claimed that the banking issue was a simple clerical mistake, fiercely swearing that he would drive directly to the local courthouse first thing the next morning. He aggressively promised to immediately file the emergency guardianship petitions, legally declaring his father completely incapacitated and finally seizing permanent control of the entire family fortune. He was actively planning my complete legal execution, all from the cramped back seat of a foul-smelling, poorly maintained commercial taxi. The yellow van merged onto the busy interstate, navigating carefully through the heavy morning traffic toward the wealthy, meticulously manicured neighborhoods of Bellevue. The drive took nearly 45 minutes. Every single mile pulled them closer to the ultimate devastating reality check of their miserable lives. I sat comfortably in Mitchell Reed's towering downtown office, quietly listening to the real-time audio feed just as the taxi finally turned into their exclusive, tree-lined residential loop. The quiet, serene streets looked exactly the same as always, until the taxi slowly idled to a halt directly in front of the familiar premium double lot. The sudden deafening silence that descended inside that taxi would have been spectacular to witness firsthand. The beautiful property they had so proudly called their own was completely unrecognizable. It no longer looked like a pristine, multi-million-dollar residential sanctuary. It looked like an aggressively active commercial construction site. Victor Rossi had absolutely wasted no time in maximizing his brand-new investment. The manicured green lawn Monica used to obsess over with intense fanaticism was deeply scarred by massive, heavy-duty diesel tire tracks. A massive, bright red commercial real estate sign was hammered deep into the soft front yard, boldly displaying the word "sold" in massive, undeniable white lettering. The elegant custom front door had been completely removed, entirely replaced by a temporary sheet of thick, raw plywood, secured firmly with heavy steel chains and a massive commercial padlock. Several of the large bay windows on the ground floor were heavily taped over with thick plastic sheeting, actively preparing for a rapid, highly invasive corporate remodel. The massive house was entirely dark inside, completely hollow, thoroughly stripped of all prior life. But the true, absolute horror of their new situation was waiting directly on the damp concrete curb. Robert quietly narrated the chaotic scene as Derek and Monica slowly stumbled out of the yellow taxi, their jaws hanging wide open in pure, unadulterated, brain-numbing shock. They stood completely paralyzed on the public sidewalk, staring blankly at the exact spot where they usually place their municipal trash bins on collection day. There, piled carelessly into a massive, highly chaotic mountain, were dozens of heavy black industrial contractor bags. The plastic bags were violently ripped open at the seams, completely exposing the broken, discarded remnants of their entire pretentious, heavily leveraged lifestyle. A crushed, severely bent titanium golf club protruded sharply and violently from one overstuffed bag. An incredibly expensive, intricately imported designer silk dress spilled loosely from another, completely soaked by the damp, dirty morning pavement. Victor's aggressive demolition crew had cold-bloodedly and literally followed my exact, unyielding instructions. They had rapidly gutted the massive house entirely down to the bare wooden framing, violently ripping out every single material item Derek and Monica had proudly owned. And resting directly on top of that massive pile of discarded, utterly ruined designer goods was a large hand-painted cardboard sign, scribbled hastily in thick black marker by one of the anonymous demolition workers. The crude sign simply read, "Free to take." Derek blindly dropped his expensive leather travel bag directly onto the wet sidewalk. He took 2 trembling steps toward the mountain of garbage, his brain completely unable to process the sheer magnitude of the visual information in front of him. Monica finally let out a guttural scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair that echoed down the quiet street. Her furious parents stood behind the idling taxi, completely disgusted. They finally realized that their precious son-in-law was a completely broke, utterly homeless fraud who had been systematically eradicated by the very man he had tried to destroy. While Robert quietly relayed the brilliant details of the roadside breakdown through my earpiece, I was nowhere near Bellevue. I was sitting comfortably in a plush leather armchair inside the highly exclusive first-class lounge at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The ambient noise of the terminal was completely blocked out by thick glass windows. I was sipping a perfectly brewed espresso, watching the massive commercial airliners slowly taxi across the damp tarmac. The sheer contrast between my serene, luxurious surroundings and the absolute chaotic destruction playing out on that damp suburban sidewalk was incredibly satisfying. I had booked a premium ticket to a quiet, sun-drenched island in the Caribbean, having decided that I truly deserved a genuine, highly relaxing vacation. After carefully dismantling the sinister life of my only son and his incredibly arrogant wife, I took another slow, deeply appreciative sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid soothe the last remaining traces of tension in my chest. My smartphone rested flat on the polished glass table beside my espresso cup. The screen remained completely dark for several long minutes after Robert concluded his detailed surveillance report and quietly disconnected our secure call. He confirmed that the furious parents had already hailed a separate taxi, completely abandoning their disgraced daughter and humiliated son-in-law on the curb. I knew exactly what would happen next. Derek would aggressively cycle through the standard stages of grief and absolute panic. He would furiously attempt to unlock his frozen banking apps. He would desperately try to contact the corporate real estate agency listed on the massive red sign in the front yard. Finally, when every single avenue of escape was brutally slammed in his face, he would be forced to place a phone call to the man he had so cold-bloodedly plotted to lock away in a sterile medical facility. Right on cue, the smartphone lit up, vibrating sharply against the sleek glass surface. The caller ID boldly displayed Derek's name. I didn't answer right away. I leaned back in my plush chair, watching the bright screen flash, letting the incoming call ring 5 full times. I wanted him to sweat. I wanted the cold, undeniable terror of his absolute financial ruin to completely saturate his brain before he ever heard my voice. On the 6th ring, I calmly reached out, picked up the device, and pressed the green button. I brought the phone to my ear, maintaining a deliberate, complete silence. "Dad!" Derek screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, unfamiliar hysteria. "Dad, what the hell is happening? Where are you? You need to fix this right now. Our house is completely locked down. There's thick plywood nailed over the front windows. Some crazy construction company threw all of our clothes into a garbage pile on the street." I could hear the chaotic traffic noise of rushing cars in the background, heavily laced with the sharp, piercing sound of Monica violently sobbing. She was audibly wailing, letting out a continuous, breathless sound of pure material loss. "My bank accounts are empty," Derek continued, his breathing turning into short, panicked gasps. "The joint emergency funds are completely wiped out. My personal debit card was declined. The cruise line thoroughly humiliated us. They locked our room cards. Monica's parents just dumped us on the sidewalk and drove away. You need to call the bank immediately. You need to call the police. Someone stole our identities. Someone stole the house. Dad, you have to do something right now." He was practically hyperventilating, desperately clawing at the incredibly fragile hope that this was all just a massive, catastrophic mistake. He was still trying to play the role of the concerned, innocent son, counting on his wealthy father to immediately swoop in and financially rescue him. I slowly took a deep breath, letting his frantic, pathetic demands hang heavily over the digital connection between us. When I finally spoke, my voice was a smooth, incredibly icy whisper of absolute, unyielding authority. "I don't have Alzheimer's, son," I stated, pronouncing each syllable with razor-sharp precision, "but I did have a profound, life-altering epiphany." The silence on the other end of the line was instant and absolute perfection. The noisy background traffic of the street seemed to completely freeze. Even Monica's hysterical wailing was briefly choked off, snapping into sudden terror. The sheer, undeniable weight of my words slammed directly into his chest. He suddenly realized that I knew everything. absolutely everything. I didn't wait for him to construct a pathetic, desperate lie. I methodically laid out the complete, inescapable reality of his brand new existence. I sold the house, Derek, I continued, my tone entirely stripped of any parental warmth or lingering mercy. I liquidated the entire Bellevue property to a corporate cash buyer 2 days ago. I authorized a completely unconditional, strictly as-is transaction. That means every single piece of custom furniture, every designer handbag, and those premium golf clubs you loved so much legally belong to the demolition crew. I explicitly instructed them to treat your possessions exactly like absolute garbage, just as the two of you proved yourselves to be. Dad, please, Derek whimpered, his voice shrinking into a pathetic, broken whisper. You can't do this to us. You gave us that house. It's ours. It was a revocable trust, I smoothly corrected him. A trust that I permanently revoked the exact same day you decided to officially cancel our family cruise via a cowardly text message. And those bank accounts you are currently crying about, I drained them. I legally transferred every single penny of my hard-earned cash into a highly secure, standalone account. You have absolutely nothing left, Derek. You are officially broke, completely homeless, and permanently cut off from the immense wealth you so arrogantly assumed you were entirely entitled to steal. No, no, no. You can't just leave us like this, Derek pleaded, a genuine, suffocating panic entirely overtaking his words. We don't have a place to sleep tonight. We don't have money for a basic hotel. We don't even have money for food. You have to help us. We're your family. The moment the two of you sat in that bedroom and actively plotted to lock me away in a medical prison, you ceased to be my family, I replied, my voice dropping into a dangerous, freezing register. You thought you could legally declare me mentally incompetent and seize everything I owned? I paused, listening to his terrified breathing. Monica began screaming in the background, begging me to forgive them. I completely ignored her, delivering the final, devastating blow. By the way, Mitchell has already delivered your fraudulent incompetence petition, along with a signed copy from that corrupt doctor, directly to the FBI, accusing you of conspiracy to commit elder fraud. Derek let out a choked, horrific sound. You're looking at a very lengthy federal criminal indictment, I added. I highly suggest you use whatever loose change you have left to hire a defense attorney. I hung up the phone, picked up my premium travel bag, and walked confidently toward my departure gate, ready to begin my new life.